Hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming here tonight as we hear from author Roy Hoffman discuss his new book, The Promise of the Pelican. He's joined here tonight by fellow author Michael Gerhardt. My name is Marella, and I'm the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And again, thank you for supporting our store. It really helps us as we continue to bring great programs like this one to you in the future. To make our events accessible, to make our events accessible, we are recording tonight's event, and it's going to go up in our YouTube channel within a few days. And I kindly ask that the authors conclude by 7 p.m. because we are closing the store, and we have to be mindful of our colleagues. So now I'm going to do a brief intro for both authors. Roy Hoffman is the award-winning author of novels Come Land Fall, Chicken Dreaming Corn, and Almost Family, as well as the nonfiction novels Alabama Afternoons and Back Home. He has written essays for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, and was a journalist and speechwriter in New York before returning to the South. He has reviewed numerous works for the New York Times Book Review and is on the faculty of Spalding University Graduate School of Writing. He is a native of Mobile and a Tulane graduate, but he resides in Fairhope, Alabama. As I mentioned before, he's joined tonight by Michael Gerhardt, who is the Burton Craig Distinguished Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Go Heels. His op-eds have appeared in the New York Times and Washington Post. In 2015, he became the first legal scholar to serve as the Library of Congress's principal advisor in revising the official annotation of the United States Constitution. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, Deborah, right over there. Their 3 sons, Ben, Daniel, and Noah, as well as their 2 dogs, Ari and Lila. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak very long because this is Roy's show, and I'm really happy for it to be Roy's program. I'm honored just to be able to get to see our old friend again and to be able to ask him some questions. By way of background, Roy and I both grew up in Mobile, Alabama, just a few years ago. And so I thought maybe a good place to start, Roy, I've actually had a lot of difficulty figuring out what's the one question I'll lead with. So I'm going to go, what I want to ask you actually is, you of course have a distinguished background in writing. If you were to characterize yourself as a writer, would you characterize yourself as a Southern writer, American novelist? What kind of writer might you want us to think about when we approach your books?
Thanks. Well, the question of how I characterize myself as a writer is, first off, I think like anybody in the arts, I work from a place that is not so much one of how I define myself as how I see the world. And then perhaps, once I'm published, come to a sense of how my work fits into a larger context. Because I was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1953, grew up in a family of native Alabamians with grandparents who had moved to the Deep South from Eastern Europe, and that's a whole story unto itself. Southern Jews, and grew up feeling both Southern and Jewish, very much Alabamian, very much of Mobile, Alabama, and at the same time connected to these stories that reached all over the world. Because after all, on Mobile's old mercantile block, Dolphin Street, not only did my grandparents speak Yiddish, but their neighbors spoke Lebanese and Greek and Spanish. So I grew up with a strong sense of being of a place with connections to the world. So if I think of myself as a Southern writer, it's really as a global Southern writer. if I think of myself as an American writer, it's an American writer who's rooted in a certain place. So I do everything I can in the arts to enlarge my sense of connection. So if people think of me as a Southern writer, so be it. If people think of me as a Jewish writer, so be it. But above all, I'm a storyteller, which is a tradition that runs across the cultures. Two of my favorite sayings for writing are, one, as Henry James said, a writer is one on whom nothing is lost. So it's a way of addressing the world, of taking it in, of keeping pocket notebooks, which I do and have boxes of having worked as a journalist, as a speechwriter, of having written fiction since I've been a teenager and in college. If I'm thought of as a Jewish writer, it's because I also, living in what has been characterized as the Christ-haunted South, as I think Flannery O'Connor once said, feel very comfortable here, very conversant with people of all backgrounds, and yet love to put in my earphones as I walk on Mobile Bay on a Sabbath evening and listen, because I've gotten spoiled through Zoom, to the prayers and the sermon coming from Springhill Avenue Temple, where we grew up. So the second is that a writer is somebody who appreciates stories, and everybody has a story to tell. And there may be 10, 12, 15 of us in this room, but if for some reason we had a tornado come through and then we were all having to be here, locked in for the next day, we would get to know these incredible stories of each of you, the histories of each of you, personal as well as family. And I even think about that when I'm on the New York subway, though it never gives my wife Nancy, who's here with us this evening, any sense of security to imagine that we're going to be on the subway for 24 hours in some sort of crisis. And I would say, but just think of all the stories we could hear. And she says, that's very little comfort. An American writer, a Southern writer, a Jewish writer, but above all, somebody who loves character, narrative, and story that crosses all those lines, and therefore not to be confined by any of those definitions, but to feel expanded by them.
Well, I'm thinking 24 Hours on New York Subway isn't a novel as much as it's a movie. But it's one I'd probably go see. My kids used to think it was a ride, when they were little. They get in the front. I want to talk, obviously, about your newest book, The Promise of the Pelican. But before I do, one other sort of prefatory question. And that's just, are there particular writers that you have found to be influential in your own background, in your own approach to writing?
The question about the writers that influenced me is one that we could have conversations about for a very long time. But what I want to really talk about is the writers that have come to impact me, who I've gotten to know in some personal way. I cannot sit here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, without summoning the name of Eli Evans, a close friend of ours who's in his early 80s now. He's dealing with some health challenges. But when I was in college and in my 20s and first got to know Eli's work, he wrote exquisitely about growing up in Durham, North Carolina, the son of the mayor, the 4-term mayor of Durham, of going to Chapel Hill, of going to New York City. Ultimately, by the way, his foundation, the Revson Foundation, was one of the organizations that helped to found and generate the UNC's Center for Jewish Studies, or whatever the official title of it is. And, there is an eloquence, a poise to Eli's essays. And why did he write his book called The Provincials? Because Willie Morris, the great memoirist based out of Mississippi, when he was editor of Harper's Magazine back in the 1960s, I think it was, said to Eli, hey, you ought to go south and tell the story of the Jews in the South. And he wrote a memoir that wasn't just regional or parochial, and I don't mean that in necessarily a negative way, but it wasn't just about a place. But again, it was a very American story that helped to illuminate the sort of the grandeur of this cross-section of cultures. At the same time, Willie Morris also asked Albert Murray, a black writer from Mobile, Alabama, to go and to write a book, which became South to a Very Old Place, which is about his leaving Harlem and traveling all through the Southeast, ending up in an area called Magazine Point, Alabama, where now famously the stories that Ben Raines has been writing about the finding the old slave ship Clotilda, it was in that particular locale. So Murray, African American, Eli being Jewish, two of the writers who I got to know and spend time with, because then, even though Albert Murray had grown up much older, gone to Tuskegee, was friends with Ralph Ellison, I would go see him when I was in New York, in Harlem, and wrote a piece about him, as I wrote a piece about Eli for, I think, the Atlanta paper, as we first got to know each other. And so sometimes it's been the experience not only of the writers in terms of what they have written, but some of the experiences that I've been able to have personally to be shaped and touched by them in some way. And also the people who have read me. I'm very honored today to have the family of my late friend David Weiner, who was an attorney in Dallas. I was in college with as an undergraduate. And David was also very important to me, as some close friends have been, because he was a first reader, somebody that I could share my work with. Not necessarily a critic or a mentor or an editor, but just somebody who could be a sounding board. So I think knowing some people along the way who begin to influence you, having some friends who understand you and don't necessarily perhaps give you the literary insights you need, but perhaps those more human insights that are so important, have been very critical to me. And the last writer I'd like to mention, with real North Carolina connections, is now largely forgotten, and I have trouble reading him anymore. His name was Thomas Wolfe. Because when I was 16 years old, I read Look Homeward Angel. Yeah. When I was in high school, the same high school that you, who didn't? But I was swept away, and we had almost a little kind of cult of 3 or 4 of us who loved English and loved reading. And because Thomas Wolfe felt bigger and brighter and stronger and, more, robust and everything. He was kind of a Superman figure, misunderstood, It was very adolescent, too. I loved it. And over the years, I found him a little bit harder to read, a little bit harder. And several years ago, Nancy and I were in Asheville. Mm-hmm. And, of course, I went to the Thomas Wolfe house and roamed around it and heard those stories. And it wasn't so much that it continued to inspire me, or as it took me back to some of those early kinds of impulses. So, just about, there's so many voices that have touched me in some way. And perhaps my greatest honor as a writer has been thanks to our daughter, Meredith, who, when she was a teenager, entered a contest in high school to write an essay about To Kill a Mockingbird. We lived in New York. We're from Alabama, had moved back to Alabama. And it was judged, among other high school students, essays about To Kill a Mockingbird, to see how Alabama had changed since the time of the novel and today, or at the time, this was probably about the year around the year 2000 or something. And Meredith won the statewide contest, the prize being a trip to Tuscaloosa to have lunch with Harper Lee.
Wow, that's cool.
Now, it was at the president's mansion. All the different winners were there. In their Sunday finest, everybody had gone out and gotten their dresses and their coats and ties, all these teenagers. And but Meredith, being the statewide winner, got to sort of be the honoree. But Harper Lee had actually blurbed a novel of mine, Chicken Dreaming Corn, inspired by my grandparents and their life on Dauphin Street, Mobile's old mercantile block, with all these multiplicity of voices, the old men with Yiddish and smoking cigars in the rocking chairs, while the Confederate veterans marched down the street on Confederate Veterans Day, now in their 80s and 90s or whatever it would be. And Harper Lee got hold of it and gave me a blurb, which was amazing. So on the way up to Tuscaloosa, Nancy, we were driving there, kept saying, "Now remember, Roy, this is about Meredith. This is not about you." And our daughter at the time said, "It's okay, Mom. It's okay. It's Meredith's. She won the contest." I said, "But Harper Lee, no, Harper Lee blurbed your book, but this is about our daughter." So we got there, and then Meredith was introduced to Harper Lee, who maybe Bill, you got to know her, or Marcy, but she was always a very enigmatic figure. Right? And here was this lovely grandmother type with this gray hair and these big glasses and a hearing aid, just talking to all these young people. She loved all these teenagers. And then the host for the event said, "Oh, Miss Lee, we'd like to introduce you now to the winner, Meredith Hoffman." And she said, "Oh, Meredith, it's so good to meet you, and on and on. I loved your essay." And then Meredith said, "This is my mom, Nancy. This is my dad, Daddy Roy Hoffman." And Harper Lee said, "I was wondering when I saw that name, Meredith Hoffman from Daphne, Alabama, if she was related to Roy Hoffman." And so she introduced us, and then Harper Lee held out her arms and hugged me and gave me a big kiss on the cheek. I've not washed that cheek since. Forget teenage girls and McCartney, back in those days. This was, Harper Lee. So again, a powerful influence, her novel, but also that it felt alive to me because I met the person who wrote it, So that's one of the great things about these literary exchanges, whether writers are famous or you know them from the community or meeting any artist, is that it becomes a very living kind of experience, this exchange of stories and books.
And in fact, today marks the anniversary of Harper Lee's birthday.
Oh, it does?
It does?
Yes.
This
Which
is
is-
also Danielle's birthday.
That's great.
Wow.
Which is why we were all getting together. So, of course, you've written a book, the Promise of the Pelican. A good place to start with your terrific new book is the title. Where did you get the title from? And,
Michael, we can't hear.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm talking about the Promise of the Pelican and asking about the title.
Thank you. I recently I found yet again the original manuscript, which I write by hand, hundreds and hundreds of pages of scratching on legal pads. And I like for writing students to title something when they're working on it. If they send me something that says Untitled, I said, come up with some kind of a title to help focus it. So I had drawn a picture on the whole sack of papers that I had of an old man on the pier throwing a fishing net, which is looks like as tall as a skirt. You do it over your shoulder and you throw it in these big circles to get fish, which is one of the opening images. And I had drawn a quick sketch, and underneath it I had the working title, which I had forgotten, called The Cast Net. Because this is considered to be a crime novel. I didn't write it as a crime novel, but it does start with a crime. It does end with a trial. So the agent and the editor said, why don't we put it in the crime category and maybe you'll sell a few more books too, So I said, okay, sure, But that no longer, even though the idea of a cast net of all these people being sort of, caught together was one kind of a working metaphor. I wanted something that had more uplift to it, more sense of possibility. And one day Nancy and I were down at Gulf Shores or Orange Beach. I'm sure many of you know the Gulf Coast, how those beautiful V's of pelicans just come swooping over, catching the wind and the thermals, and how magnificent they are. And suddenly I wanted to write something with this image of a pelican in it. And so the way you come up with the title, at least, is you put down thousands of possibilities and then you crowdsource it. Not I guess the new generation puts it on the internet and says, these are the titles, what do you think? But it's like talking to friends, my sister, whoever it might be. And suddenly, I don't know, we were talking and I hit on some notion of the promise of the pelican. Why? Because when I see pelicans overhead on Mobile Bay or down at Gulf Shores, I have this optimistic sense, this feeling of the promise of the next day, of the sense of possibility, and also that sense that they are almost in a spiritual way making some kind of a promise to me about the grandeur of nature and the world. And so I started researching it, and lo and behold, the promise of the pelican turned out to be lore from the Middle Ages, that a pelican will pierce its own breast to feed its starving chicks in the event of a crisis. So those little chicks will never starve. And there is all this iconography. And at the front of the book, there's even an image that is in color in the illuminated manuscript in the Getty Museum, but it was public domain, but we could only print it in black and white, of a pelican piercing its breast. And we found a line from Shakespeare about the life-rendering pelican. So it played perfectly into one of the themes, one of the big themes of my novel, which is the protection of the young and the vulnerable, those most innocent. And now, when I see the pictures of the refugees in Ukraine struggling with their little ones, clasped to their breasts or holding them, one on the hip, one on the bosom, rushing for safety. I think of, again, how universal and primal this is. I remember the photograph of the newsreel in Afghanistan after the collapse of Afghanistan, when the Afghani man holding a little baby up to the soldiers in the U.S. combat. Take my baby, no matter what you do. Just, that kind of trust. So that's a powerful theme in a novel in which the two main characters are both an 82-year-old when it begins, a man who lost his family in the Holocaust, who escaped and who was brought through kind of an underground to the United States as a little boy, adopted by a family in Alabama and raised in Selma, Alabama, a Jewish family, and he's Jewish, from Amsterdam, and a young Honduran in his 20s who has come here, one, to escape the gangs, but also, as a little boy, saw his whole village devastated by Hurricane Mitch in the late 1900s, around 1998 or 99, that I had covered as a journalist, in which 12,000 Hondurans died, mostly in mudslides. And there were these incredible refugee camps, and I went down and saw them, because these are not countries like, as bad as things were here during Katrina and how abysmal the reaction was, and these countries in Central America that have so few resources, what becomes a place for the displaced soon becomes an entire village and city of, after years of people being stuck there. And how when he comes here, his early recollection, the backstory is having lost so much in Mitch and then having had to leave Central America to escape the gangs. And then also for Hank, the old man, to look back on the life that he had known and how it was stolen from him as well. So, Promise of the Pelican, in every case, it's some sacrifice the parents made to make sure the children, if they could survive, and also, in many cases, for the characters themselves, do what they can for the next generation. And it's just primal. I mean, it's universal. It's visceral, And I like, when I can, to write from that place that's visceral, like we all like to live from that place that's visceral when we can. So, thanks.
I want to give you a chance to do this if you wish to do it, and that is some of our audience may well be familiar with your writing, some may not be. Do you want to share any of the book with them, or should they?
Well, I don't know. Let's see. I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. We have a little bit. I do want to say one other thing. Sure. That's important to me, and that is that this is the fourth novel that I have written. And whereas I think that I'm always sitting down to create anew, it's been pointed out to me by readers and critics that, in fact, there are certain kinds of themes that I'm interested in.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. For example, Don Noble, who is a retired professor from University of Alabama, reviews books for Alabama Public Radio and also has a wonderful television interview show. And when he reviewed my novel a few weeks ago for Alabama Public Radio, he began by saying, after 2 books of essays and 4 novels, Roy Hoffman has become one of Alabama's best storytellers. Well, you didn't think I was going to quote a bad review, did you? But he then goes on to say, among writers in Alabama, at least, and perhaps this region, he has a kind of, he said a niche, but it's not a niche. To me, it's a point of view or a way. He said, in which his focus is, in as much as the areas of focus are an interest in relations between black and white, his interest is also, and it's true, between my characters and people of other backgrounds, not always as well represented. And I know, for example, in the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture that Bill Ferris has been one of the editors of, there are sections on the Asian South and the Latino South and so on and so forth. Those are some of the Souths that I very much wanted to explore and have in my novels. So in my earlier novel, Come Landfall, there are characters who are from the Vietnamese boat people who came into where we are on the Gulf Coast through Catholic Charities after the fall of Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos. In this novel, it's very much bound up in the story of some of the Latino families that have come into our area. In Chicken Dreaming Corn, it was very much the Eastern European immigrants of my grandparents' generation. And Almost Family was a little bit different. It was a little bit more traditional, black and white in that relationship. So, what is the theme? An editor asked me in Alabama. It's this sort of focus on and embracing of the other. Y'all know what I mean by the other. You know, if this were New York City or Chicago, the dynamic might be very different. I did live in New York City for 20 years, which in a way almost made me more sensitive to this when we moved back south for a year, 20 years ago. You know, the kudzu just kind of comes up around you, right? But
I thought you can't go home again.
you can't go home again. Well, you can't go home again. On the other hand, it was interesting to go home because to reframe it. I think if you go home again, you have to sort of reframe your home, you know, to see it in a different way. And I became very interested in all these other cultures. And again, to some degree, the paradigm was set by our grandparents being in a place where there were so many cultures. And my dad, who lived to 97 and was very clear to the very end, who'd grown up over the store in the 1900s and could tell those stories and made them as real as yesterday. And my friend David Weiner, whose father was from Poland and his mother was from Mexico, and carried these stories very much about being a new American. So as a third generation, and certainly this begins to thin out over the years, it's always been a very close kind of story for me. But how do you live in a place where so many people still just trust people who are different from them, right? How do you live in a place where to speak with a different language or to pray to a different God or in a different way, or not at all, as my non-deistic friends tell me to, how do you get along? How do you bring people together? It's obviously become one of the important questions of our time across the country. If we don't fracture as a result of not being able to, I don't mean just embrace the other, but even have a conversation with the other, with people who are different. So it's a theme that I explore here, and I guess it's been an ongoing theme through all of my work. And I don't know, Michael, we knew each other all the way going back to high school, and it wasn't just from being in a small Jewish community, because I've lived, again, in Brooklyn, but I think it was something that you get sensitized to at a young age, and it helped to create a kind of a catalyst for that question. So maybe all of my work, in a way, and all of my fiction at least, becomes a way of trying to answer that question. And I felt by now, somehow or another, that it might become an old, stale, kind of dated question. But is it?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's a question that great literature wrestles with and addresses for centuries. And, of course, it's central to storytelling. The other thing about the question I think you raised is that, of course, the storyteller sometimes is the other. That is to say, we are the other. Aren't we the other to some people? People that grew up Jewish in Mobile. I remember when I got to college and people thought I was a fraud because I didn't have a Southern accent.
Right.
They had an image, of course. But more importantly, we still are, to some extent, because of our distinctive backgrounds and cultures and outlooks and perhaps faith, are are regarded by some people as the other.
You know, Eli Evans told me something that was really important once, and he said he had been told this by his mother, Sarah, who was one of the leading figures in Hadassah at the time. She said, you know, Eli, a Jew in the South is always teaching. And I really took that to heart in the sense of if you're perceived as being different or other by people, if they approach you with an honest curiosity, which many do, or misunderstanding, then it helps to be able to talk about or to explain or to put yourself into context with them that perhaps they can't understand. Because it's still the case that I'm the only Jewish person that someone meets. Maybe not somebody who's a cosmopolitan person in Mobile or wherever it might be, but lots of folks who maybe just only know Jews through the stereotypes or through reading, you know, the Bible in their country church. You know, for 2 or 3 years I covered religion for my newspaper group, which was really quite something. And how often I would meet with an honest curiosity, you know? They would say, well, you write about religion, what church do you go to? And I'd say, well, I'm Jewish. And they'd say, well, you mean like a Jewish Christian? And I'd say, no, like a Jewish Jew. And I remember the wife of one country pastor said, and it was a very genuine kind of question, she says, but what do you do about heaven? And I didn't resent that. I didn't want to ridicule it or stereotype it. I tried to, even though the journalist is not really supposed to put the focus on himself or themselves, but I tried to sort of explain some of what, in the simplest sense, you know, I could explain maybe our concept of what it is or isn't or could be, you know, and that kind of thing. So I think the process of writing is very much about answering questions too, you know, what's important. I'll read you just a little bit of a scene here, since we're on this discussion. By the way, the book has 57 chapters. It's meant to move pretty quickly. There are 5 or 6 main characters, including Hank's daughter, who's in her 30s, who's a lawyer, who's dealing with some substance abuse problems, alcohol, for partying down south. And her little son, who's only 5, who has some neurological challenges. And the granddaddy, because the daughter is in a rehab facility, it sort of takes care of the little boy and takes him fishing in the morning. And that's really, really important. For example, the sense of place is important. I'll just read you a few paragraphs of the opening chapter. So it's dawn. Lupita, the young woman who works for him in Honduras, hasn't shown up. She will soon and say that her brother's being wanted by the police. And because she's late to take care of his little grandson, the old gentleman decides to take the 5-year-old with him down to the pier. So Hank goes out, he gets his net, he rinses it off, he puts it in a wagon, and then they start off towards the pier, he with his little boy. Behind them as they walked, Roger's little legs moved in a lopsided gait. The wagon bumped and rattled. Through the trees, Hank caught his first glimpse of the pier, stretching out a 1/4 mile into the water. There was a skein of light over the bay. There it is, Roger, look, Fairhope Pier. We're going to catch some fish. Fair. Because the little boy sort of speaks in sort of fragments. Fair. Yes, fair, and plenty of them if we hurry. During Hank's career practicing law, the glimpse of old men languishing... Did I turn that off? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Want to use mine?
Yeah, thanks. During the decades of Hank practicing law, the glimpse of old men languishing on a pier on a workday morning made him shake his head at the thought of old folks whose productive lives were over. Now he could not get to his spot fast enough, his heart leaping with the sight of every mullet net spinning out in a golden circle. You know those beautiful nets that go up in the air. They arrived at the top of the bluff, the sidewalk leading down to the pier in a long curve. The water was slick. Pelican swooped and plummeted to scoop up shiny menhaden before flapping aloft again. At the pier start, he saw the Flounder King and the retired butcher nicknamed Captain, and the man who spoke through a hole in his throat called O'Fella, and the Reverend Jonathan Blue all focused on their endeavors. They got to the end of to the pier, to a spot the regulars knew was Hank's, and settled in. "You sit here." Hank lifted the ice chest out of the wagon, set it down, and patted the lid. Roger took his position. "Now," Hank said, "we prepare." This is the image. He's making his net up. I should actually stand up to show you how it's done. So, am I going to lose? I don't know if I'm going to lose the image there. Position. Now, Hank, we prepare. How he loved the swirl of the netting rising over his arm. Its folds, like Marjorie's skirt, slipped off, bunched against the sofa. And he's widowed. He's lost his wife. He lengthened out part of the net, shook out the kinks, and trained his gaze on the bay. "Know what I'm looking for?" Roger sat motionless, staring out, then turned his eyes to his grandfather. "Look there, son." Even though the sky was cloudless, a patch of darkness moved swiftly over the water as if a fragment of cloud blown across the sky were casting a shadow. It's a spirit breathing on the water. The spirit raced towards them, and Hank rocked back, then forward, letting the net fly. The orb of light on the Prince and Groch Canal from his childhood window, the turn in the Alabama River at Selma when he was a teen, the full moon rising across the woods from the bay, all the patterns of his life blending into this near-perfect O of netting that turned straight down and lassoed the bay. There was a shimmer of silver beneath the surface. "Look, Roger." He pulled on the cord, he brings it up, it plops onto the pier, and it's filled with mullet. Roger got up cautiously, bending to the creatures, holding a hand out, a tiny finger pointing to the eye of the biggest mullet. The mullet gave one violent spasm, flopping up as if a violent fish, and Roger took off, his little legs churning, no longer the tyke lollygagging on the walk, but a 4-year-old making a dash for the railing of the pier, up and over it now. And then, as Hank watches aghast, falling down into the bay. And then I'll read a little bit from a later chapter. By now, you've also seen the character of Julio, who is walking home from his work at the Grand Hotel. I'm sorry, that's fictional. The Bay Resort Hotel. For YouTube audience, Grand Hotel is not, it's not actually you that I'm talking about. When Julio sees a golfer clutching a pin of the 17th hole who's been stabbed in the chest, and Julio goes to his assistance, and the man holds him and begins to sag to the ground. And then somebody sees them from another greenskeeper, who shouts. And Julio, who came to this country on, I think it's called an HB2 visa, a work visa to work in a resort hotel, non-agrarian workers would come for these periods of time for these big resort communities, has overstayed his visa, knows he's undocumented, and of course is going to run, which he does, which sort of sets his story into motion. And then there's a manhunt that is underway. So that sort of goes on simultaneously to this first scene where Hank is with his grandson, at which point Julio's sister comes to Hank and says, "My brother needs your help." But a few chapters later, while Julio is still on the run, and Hank is still trying to come to terms with both his little grandson and also the pressure that he's beginning to get to help Julio if he's caught, he goes out on one of his weekly assignments, monthly assignments, to speak to kids in the middle schools about being a Holocaust survivor. So, he goes out to the schools.
Raining pages.
Raining pages. So Hank goes out to the school, and all of these refugees and such do this. Hank saw the astonishment, the incredulity of the students when he appeared in their class, the walking embodiment of a time they'd read about in history books. He'd begin with an overview of his birth country. "The Netherlands is a small country," he told them, only 16,000 square miles. Alabama's 52,000 square miles. Before World War II, the Netherlands was home to 140,000 Jews. In Alabama, there are 9,000 Jews. So you have an idea of just how many of us thrive there, with more than half of us, 75,000 Jews in the city of Amsterdam, like my family. My father was a businessman, he tells them. My mother a homemaker. We lived in a canal house. We were happy. I was only 4 or 5 and remember one day after the German soldiers came, my family, all the Jews had to wear a yellow star. I was 5 years old. I thought it was pretty. My older brother Benjamin hated his and said he would rip it off. My father told my brother to do as we were told. It was 1941 and the Nazis were in charge. By 1945, when the war ended, he told them nearly 3 out of every 4 of us, think of that. He pointed to 3 students and then a 4th, had been deported to the concentration camps, including my mother and father, my sister and brother. We were seen as flawed, as other, as subhuman. Who could believe that but a madman? The students looked terrified. Yet so many followed that madman. Before I tell you my own story, he said, let us have a moment of silence to remember the victims of genocide. In the profound quiet, he gazed out at the children, heads bowed, innocent and protect them. God bless you all, he said in his silence. And then Hank thinks to himself, I can't keep doing this. It's too much. It's hard for me. So he goes on to tell the story about how the Jews were taken to a deportation center. And you can see it when you go to Amsterdam. It's not as developed yet as some of the others. And how the grown-ups were put here, and then the children were taken to a facility across the street and kept there. And how the grown-ups thought, well, the children will never be hurt. They will be kept safe there. But in the middle of the night, the children were also added to the transports and taken away. And how Hank, as a little boy, would wake up crying. And how the teacher would take them on little exercise walks around the block. She was good-hearted. And then they came back. The German soldier would count them, he would count them in German. And the last little child in the line was Hank. And suddenly, another boy jumped down, took his place, and Hank himself was thrown into a motor car, shrouded, taken to a church, then to an abbey, then to a farmer's, taken into the Dutch underground with other children, eventually put on a boat to America. And he tells this story to the students. This is one of the important chapters. And then, as he tells these details, the students are spellbound. And he says that on the boat to America, he would call out, Mama, Papa, burying his head to cry in the pillow. In New York City, he said, a kind couple met me. An organization called the Workmen's Circle had contacted them. They had no children of their own. Would you like to go home with us to a nice, cozy place and live with us until your mama and papa return, they said. I was cold. I had a hungry belly. They told me they had a warm puppy waiting to lick my face and sleep next to me in the bed. He heard sniffles in the classroom. He saw a girl take out a box of Kleenex, pass them to her friends. What do you think I answered? Softly together, the students said, yes. Yes, I answered yes. They brought me to Selma, Alabama, and I went by the name Hank. Mama and Papa, so far away from me, thousands of miles by the map, could never come for me. He paused, knowing how the words would wrench the hearts of the beautiful children held wrapped before him, but he owed them the truth. They died in a Nazi gas chamber. He hung his head, the sadness welling up. This is my last school presentation, he thought. I can't do this anymore. He looked back up. Don't let anyone who is different from you in any way, their color, religious belief, language they speak, how they look or act or love, give rise to hatred in you. Hatred shattered my world, orphaned me, destroyed millions. But it takes more courage to love than to hate. It was love, the risk by Jews and Christians to hide me, the open arms of an American couple to adopt me, the heart of a beautiful wife and daughter to help me make me who I am, the path of goodness to guide me. That is my salvation. I'm a Jew who says a bracha, that means a prayer every morning on waking and every night before going to sleep. Children, we must be grateful for our blessings and open our hearts to others. And we must never forget. Thank you.
One of my favorite parts. We have 10 minutes at best,
Yeah.
so maybe it's a good time to take some questions. Yes?
I'm curious, this is a very sort of basic question, but Hank, was he inspired by anybody? I mean, I know your dad was a lawyer well into his old age too.
Sorry. This microphone is not working right here. I did not realize that Hank was inspired by my father, except that my father was a very old lawyer. And,
It was all.
oh, okay. Thank you. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to law school. But one of the things that my father taught me without my knowing, because after all, we're always learning, being imprinted by people, even without knowing it, and what it was like to get old and to still be blessed with vitality in old age, and yet also to deal with the challenges of getting older. So in working with the character who begins at 82 and 83 and is about 85 when the novel ends, was something that appealed to me. And also to know what it meant to be retired and what it meant to think about coming back to work at his age, whether this would be draining and enervating or whether it would be also revitalizing in some ways, especially as he's also widowed and lonesome. And so this story is also about renewal by the hardest. And so I guess my father, though he was older, did lose my mom first, and that there were certain elements in his character, from his character, that I wanted to explore. And also my dad had a kind of a toughness and a grit about him, which I want Hank and hope that he has as well. Kindness and gentleness, but a toughness as well. And particularly these old, criminal defense attorneys, as he said, at the end, my purpose isn't to solve the crime, but to make sure the wrong man doesn't hang on my watch, and he'll do anything for that. And he also is determined, even though his daughter has no interest in criminal law, it's, she will start in sort of as in banking law, that there is a feeling that of what he had seen as a little boy, that the law was very important to him, that the state doesn't make the law as it wishes, but has to be responsive to the law. And I do remember my dad sitting up late, sketching out, his opening statements and his defenses, and going with him to court as well in later years. So, and it was also inspired by where we live, and we often go to see the gentlemen and women, but mostly the old men, throwing their nets. And one of the first journalistic pieces I did when we moved back was to write about Fairhope Pier, and especially all of the old-timers, each of whom has a very amazing story. This one was a World War II veteran, this one raised 10 children, this one had lost a fortune, made it, and lost another. And so one of the things, I'm 68, about getting older, and I have friends now who are in their 80s, or even older, hopefully, is that if everybody has a story to tell, those who have many years among us have even richer and longer stories to tell. So that's one thing that I learned from my dad, and so it's kind of an homage to to that generation too. Yeah, so thanks. Yes, Marcy.
I wondered, I grew up Jewish in Arkansas, but in a little bitty
Uh-huh.
agricultural community. And I often think about, like, I just wondered, when was your kind of sense of your Southern Jewish identity kind of, come into shape for you?
Right.
Was it something you were thinking about when you were a little, or your Alabama Jewish identity?
Mm-hmm.
And then I wondered what was, and you might have had, Northeast family, like I did, that was a contrast, and I saw, but then the other part too was, what was Eli's work the first that you read about that put into context something about?
I think Eli's work was the first that I read that put into context the Southern Jewish experience in that way. But I had certainly heard lots of stories and had begun doing kind of oral histories of folks, just really not for any academic purpose, but just because sometimes people would say, "Oh, would you sit down with your tape recorder and tape, my father or grandfather," this kind of thing. But, I grew up in a great, buoyant, loving family. I come from a functional family. If I were to name a memoir, an essay that, people would say, "No, that's impossible. There are no functional families." But I really did. And if anything, I was more alienated by it growing up, and felt like I couldn't wait to get away. But like anything, it was really moving to New York City when I was 22 with our eldest sister, a late eldest sister who had been living there for years, that I would meet people who'd say, "You're from Alabama, You're Jewish from Alabama?" And I like to tell the story of once being with a couple of friends who were from Long Island, who'd grown up in Jewish communities there, and they were sitting around, we were in our 20s, and one said, "In my social studies class, the teacher said, 'What percentage of the United States do you think is Jewish?'" He said, I said, "Well, it's probably about 65%. And the other guy said, "Well, I'd probably say about 80%. And I said, "Well, I'd say, let me see there, the Friedmans, the Muchnicks, the Gerhardts, the Metzgers, so you could count them all." So, but I never really thought of it as anything that would nurture my writing. It was just a kind of either something to shake or to forget, because people move away, and then and it began to kind of nurture my writing, because I began to understand that these were two very strong literary traditions, So Flannery O'Connor, Bernard Malamud, all these writers, when I was coming of age, of North Carolina, Reynolds Price, but it could also be, then all the great, Philip Roth and that whole generation. I thought, wow, I can claim them all. And so it was not at all to be peripheral, but to feel central in a way. And yet, I'm not a historian or an academic or an anthropologist. It's really something that nurtures me. And it doesn't define all of my work, but it's a place that I come from. Robbie.
So Lupita and Julio are Honduran.
Right.
So what is it that you tap into to feel that you can speak in their voices?
Right. One of the questions that I'm often asked, and that's very controversial these days, is writing across cultures.
Yes.
And it is also known as cultural appropriation. I think it's a risk that a writer has to take. I think that if I were to subtract the Hondurans from my story, because I am not a young Honduran, then I would really have the story of one old, Jewish lawyer writing his memoirs, which is an absolutely valid story too. But what I have come to feel, and I've actually been confronted on this, I was on a panel in New Orleans at the Tennessee Williams Festival, in which I said, how can you possibly feel it's your right to tell the story? And I said, I want these characters to tell their own stories. I'm extremely interested in the literature that comes out of every single, culture in the world, and certainly within the United States, all the hybrids and such. But the story that I want to tell, at least in this book, is one that has to be across cultures. Because after all, culture only runs so deep, in that maybe I tap into Julio because I've been on that mountainside as a journalist, and I saw where those people were buried in the mudslide, and know for him as a little child to imagine fictionally what it was like to run down the mountain. He also has a journey of faith when he's awaiting trial in jail, as he goes from his very traditional kind of Catholic upbringing to a very heightened kind of evangelical spiritualism in the jail with the prayer groups. I don't want to give away too much, I'm told.
Oh, shoot.
But his interior life there. So I think if you can find one way of accessing the character, something that you share and understand, then you build out from there. And as I was on this panel in New Orleans, and the narrator kept referring to me as the Jewish dude. Actually, it was a straight Jewish dude from Alabama, because there were some LGBTQ, importantly, voices there too. I said, and if everybody here of all your different backgrounds and orientations want to write about a straight Jewish dude from Alabama, go ahead, because what's the worst they can do? Will it be like Modigliani makes a face, or Picasso makes a, maybe they'll render it in a certain way that is, different. But it doesn't have to be a caricature. If they listen and try and do their best, then that's the risk the artist takes. You've got to take the risk. And I think we'll probably see in the culture things moving back the other way as a new generation comes about.
And isn't the challenge of being an artist as well to exercise imagination?
Absolutely.
And in exercising imagination, you have to imagine what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes.
Yes, as Atticus says to Scout,
Yeah.
It's about walking in somebody else's shoes.
Absolutely.
It's very primal, it's very ancient, it's very visceral, but God gave us, the gift of imagination and of empathy and of compassion. And if we would just exercise the damn things, then maybe we could get a little bit further, and maybe we could get the dialogue going again.
I appreciate that, Roy. I'm going to end on just one note, just to maybe a little bit of a controversial note, so that we can be provoked a little bit. But our identities, of course, come to some extent from within, but they're also to some extent imposed on us. They are to some extent, and I wonder a little bit about Hank. Having gone through the Holocaust, his Jewish identity was, of course, not something that he just got from his family, but the Nazis, among others, were defining him as Jewish, imposing a certain identity on him because he was Jewish. Is that true for us as well?
I think this is a good question to end on, not only because our time is up, right?
Wouldn't
But
put it
also
that way.
No, but also because I think each of us has to answer that in our own way. Whether it's identity in terms of our gender, our work, our region, our place, our national identity, whatever that is. God help us these days as we begin to define it. Who defines it for you? And how do you define it yourself? And maybe part of the process of coming of age, of education, of reading in this incredible bookstore, excuse me, Flyleaf here in Chapel Hill, with every book and all the great books at the universities in North Carolina and all over the country. It's that act of imagination that will help us define ourselves. Excuse me. People will always define us who don't know us, but the trick is to get to know each other as well as we can, and I think reading is really core to that. I love the question, and it's one that I think we'll both try, and all of us can try to answer as time goes on. Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. That was great.
Thank you. It will help you get your pages.
I know. Sorry. That was like.